It was meant to be a night of celebration, the kind where everything is perfect. The music, the laughter, the people. Isabel Hayes, the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city, was looking forward to a carefree evening at the Elysian, the luxury club known for its exclusivity. But when the bouncer coldly denied her entry, she was left stunned. What she didn't know was that this rejection would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about privilege and identity. What would she do next? The crowd would soon be left in awe. Isabel Hayes was no stranger to wealth and privilege. As the daughter of Victor Hayes, a powerful billionaire whose name graced headlines regularly, Isabel's life had always been one of luxury, from grand vacations on private islands to attending the finest schools and galas. She was accustomed to being at the top of the social ladder. But behind the designer dresses, the glittering jewelry and the polished image, Isabel was tired of being seen only as her father's daughter. She wanted more. Unlike many people in her position, Isabel had a burning desire to carve out her own identity, to be known for more than just her family's fortune. She had attended the best universities, had worked with sustainable tech startups, and had even started her own small environmental consultancy. But it was hard to shake off the assumption that her success, if it ever came, would always be linked to the legacy of the Hayes name. No matter how hard she worked, the people around her always saw her as the billionaire's daughter, and that made her feel small in ways she couldn't quite explain. The night at the Elysian was supposed to be her escape, a night with friends where she could finally just relax. Her close friends, a mix of entrepreneurs and influencers from her social circle, had insisted she join them at the club, where they had reserved a VIP table. The club itself was everything she imagined, and more, a grand, opulent place where people like her seemed to belong. It was filled with polished marble floors, golden chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, and a crowd of socialites, businessmen, and celebrities who all looked the part. Isabel, dressed in a sleek black gown that made her feel like a queen, stood confidently at the entrance of the club, ready for the night ahead. She had visited the Elysian before, many times, always welcomed with open arms because of her father's standing in the city. So, when the bouncer checked the list and didn't find her name, she was taken aback. "Sorry, miss, you're not on the list," the bouncer said, his tone indifferent. "Excuse me?" Isabel responded, feeling the surprise in her voice. "I'm Isabel Hayes. My father made the reservation." The bouncer's expression didn't shift. "Doesn't matter who your father is. The list is final," he said curtly. Confused, Isabel tried to reason with him, but the door remained shut, literally and figuratively. The other people in line began to murmur among themselves, noticing the scene unfolding before them. The rejection felt like a slap in the face, not just because of the circumstances, but because of how it made her feel, like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be her domain. Her heart raced. How could this be happening? She had always been able to walk into any room, any event, and be welcomed with ease. Now, for the first time, Isabel felt the sharp sting of being judged by something other than her accomplishments, something deeper, something no amount of money could fix. Was it because she was a woman? Or was it simply because she wasn't enough in the eyes of the people who controlled places like the Elysian? With her mind spinning, she made her way down the street, her thoughts racing with questions she hadn't had to ask herself before. She had always lived in the bubble of wealth and influence, but tonight, that bubble had burst. What would she do now? How would she prove to herself and to the world that she was more than just a wealthy name? Isabel wasn't just going to walk away and forget this incident. She would find a way to make her mark, to show the world her worth without relying on her father's legacy. What came next would not only challenge her sense of self, but also reshape the way she saw power, identity, and the systems that judged people like her. Isabel spent the rest of the night walking the streets of the city, her heels clicking on the pavement, her thoughts swirling. She had always prided herself on being independent, on not relying on her father's name to get by. But now, in the face of the club's rejection, she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in the same old story, reduced to a shadow of her family's power. Her eyes burned with frustration and a deep sense of betrayal. As she walked, the city's lights seemed colder, more distant. She could hear the laughter of people inside upscale bars and see the flashing neon signs of elite clubs in the distance. The Elysian was just one of many places that catered to the rich and powerful. But tonight, it felt like a symbol of everything she hated about the life she had been born into: privilege, exclusion, and the constant pressure to be something she wasn't. But that night would spark something inside her, a determination to break free from the chains of expectation and prove to herself that she was worth more than the life she'd been handed. The following day, Isabel found herself unable to focus on anything. Her usual routine felt hollow. She scrolled through her social media feeds, her mind racing. The rejection from the Elysian had made headlines. It wasn't just about her being denied entry. It was the fact that a woman with the Hayes name, a billionaire's daughter, had been turned away from the club for seemingly no reason at all. The story went viral, sparking discussions across social media, with people questioning the value of status and whether exclusivity should be based on merit rather than wealth or family ties. Isabel was both shocked and intrigued by the attention. The more she read the posts and the comments, the more she realized how little people knew about her life beyond the money. She was the product of a legacy, yes, but she had her own dreams, her own identity. She wanted to prove that, just for once, she could stand on her own 2 feet. That evening, she received an unexpected call from an old acquaintance, Julian Carter. Julian was a journalist known for his hard-hitting investigations into the world of wealth and privilege. He had once written an article about her father's company, a critical piece that had raised some eyebrows in the business world. Isabel had always found Julian's perspective on wealth and society compelling, but their relationship had always remained professional. "Isabel," Julian said, his voice casual but sharp, "I've been following the story. I know you're not thrilled with the media circus around this, but I think you're missing an opportunity here." "What do you mean?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The story about the Elysian," Julian continued. "It's not just about you being turned away from an exclusive club. It's about something bigger. It's about the way the world sees people like you, people born into wealth, people who are judged by their last name instead of their worth. People are talking about this for a reason, Isabel." Isabel felt her pulse quicken. "And what am I supposed to do with that? It's just a stupid mistake." "A rejection?" Julian paused for a moment. "It's not about the rejection. It's about how you react to it. You have a chance here to show everyone who you are. You don't have to just be your father's daughter. You're a woman with your own voice, your own power. Why not use this as a platform to prove that you're more than just your last name?" His words struck Isabel like a lightning bolt. She had always wanted to make a difference, but she had never truly considered using her own experiences to challenge the status quo. Julian's suggestion was simple but powerful. Use the rejection to redefine yourself. Over the next few days, Isabel started to think about her next steps. She realized that, in order to truly break free from the suffocating expectations of her family, she would need to face her own insecurities. She had always been compared to her father, overshadowed by his empire, and she had never truly questioned the path set out for her. But now, in the wake of the club's rejection, she felt the need to take control of her own story. She decided to attend a private event in the city, a charity auction organized by a prominent organization that supported women's empowerment. The event was being held at a new venue, the Atlas, a rising star among exclusive clubs. The invite came from a friend of hers, Mia, an up-and-coming activist who had recently gained recognition for her work in advocating for women's rights. Isabel was hesitant at first. She wasn't sure if this event was the right place for someone like her, someone who had been exposed to the best of society's perks. But deep down, she knew it was time to push herself out of her comfort zone. When Isabel arrived at the Atlas, the atmosphere was different from what she had expected. Instead of the usual glamorous, polished crowd she was used to, there was a more casual vibe, a sense of authenticity and openness. Mia greeted her at the door, offering a warm smile. "Isabel, I'm so glad you could make it." As Isabel stepped inside, she was taken aback by the diverse group of people gathered in the room. Women from all walks of life, activists, artists, business owners, had come together to support a cause that was far more significant than the world she was accustomed to. It was about equality, social justice, and giving voices to the marginalized. Mia introduced Isabel to a few people, and soon Isabel found herself in conversation with a woman named Lena. Lena was a young entrepreneur who had started a sustainable fashion brand aimed at providing affordable clothing for women in underserved communities. As they spoke, Isabel was struck by Lena's passion for making a difference. "I've always wanted to make money and do good," Lena explained. "But the world doesn't make it easy. You have to fight for your place, and even when you have success, people still question you." Isabel, who had always taken her wealth for granted, felt a pang of guilt as Lena spoke. She realized just how much of her life had been handed to her on a silver platter. Lena's story made Isabel question everything she thought she knew about success, wealth, and social mobility. In the midst of their conversation, a familiar face caught Isabel's eye. It was Martin, the Elysian bouncer, the man who had turned her away only days before. He was standing in the corner, chatting with a few well-dressed people. Isabel's heart skipped a beat. What is he doing here? Martin noticed her gaze and immediately approached, his expression apologetic. "Isabel, right?" he said. "I didn't expect to see you here." Isabel took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, it's me," she said flatly. "But what are you doing here?" "I was invited," Martin said, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I've heard a lot about what you're doing. I think it's amazing, honestly. I never meant to offend you, you know. The whole situation was handled poorly." Isabel's stomach churned. She wanted to lash out, to remind him of how he had treated her, but instead she stayed quiet. "I'm sure you didn't," she said, keeping her tone measured. "But actions speak louder than words, don't they?" The conversation ended awkwardly, and as Isabel turned to walk away, she realized something profound. She had just confronted the person who had rejected her, but she wasn't angry anymore. In fact, she felt pity for him. He had been part of a system, a world where people like him could make others feel small. But Isabel was no longer that person. She didn't need validation from the Elysian or anyone else to prove her worth. By the time the night ended, Isabel knew she had started something within herself, a journey of self-discovery, but also a movement that could change how people saw wealth, privilege, and identity. Her story had only just begun, but she knew one thing for certain. The next chapter would be hers to write. The tension in the air at the Atlas was palpable. Isabel had just spoken her truth. She had stood up to the woman who had tried to belittle her, and in that moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hiding behind her father's wealth. She wasn't playing the role of the privileged daughter. She was simply Isabel Hayes, carving out her place in a world that had always assumed they knew her. The woman's face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and anger as Isabel walked away, but there was no turning back now. Isabel knew she couldn't allow herself to fall back into the shadows, to shrink from her own strength. This moment, this confrontation, was the test she had been waiting for, even if she hadn't realized it until now. As she reached the back of the room where the auction tables were set up, her gaze locked onto the podium where Mia stood, addressing the crowd. Mia's voice was calm, her words thoughtful as she spoke about the power of women lifting each other up. Isabel could feel the pull to join her, but she paused, letting her surroundings sink in. Behind her, Martin, the bouncer from the Elysian, approached her cautiously. His expression was apologetic, his stance hesitant. He had witnessed the exchange with the woman and had clearly seen the impact it had on the crowd. But his approach wasn't about the woman anymore. It was about Isabel. "I didn't expect that," Martin said, his voice almost a whisper. "You." He stopped, unsure how to proceed. That was powerful. Isabel's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, she saw something different in him. The man who had once denied her entry at the Elysian now stood before her, humbled, but he wasn't the person she was focused on anymore. It wasn't about the club or the rejection or anything that had happened to her in the past. It was about what she had just done. "You're right," Isabel said, her voice calm but unwavering. It was powerful. And it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who has ever been dismissed, judged, or overlooked. It was about standing up to a system that says only some people are worthy. Martin looked taken aback by her words, but there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I can't even imagine what it's like. The pressure, I mean," he said, "to always be judged by your name, by your family, and not by who you are." Isabel smiled faintly, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. It was a moment of recognition. He understood. But that wasn't enough. She had to make her own place in this world. She had to show that being a Hayes didn't define her. Her actions, her choices, would. Before she could respond, a sudden commotion drew her attention. The woman who had insulted her earlier, now standing near the bar, was glaring at Isabel with uncontained fury. She was surrounded by a small group of people who seemed eager to witness the next round of this showdown. "Isabel," the woman called, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think that standing up to me in front of everyone makes you some kind of hero? You're nothing but a spoiled, entitled little girl who's too afraid to accept that she doesn't belong here. You'll always be just your father's daughter." The words cut deep, but Isabel didn't flinch. She had heard them before, from people who didn't understand her struggles. Her entire life had been a series of expectations and assumptions, people who only saw the surface, never the depth of her character. Tonight, she had the chance to prove that she was more. She stepped forward, her heels clicking loudly on the polished floor. The room seemed to quiet, the buzz of conversations fading into the background as Isabel approached the woman. She was no longer the uncertain, rejected girl from the Elysian. She was a woman who had found her voice. With measured steps, she reached the woman, standing face to face with her. For a brief moment, the room was still. Isabel could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, the anticipation building, the expectations high, but she wasn't going to back down now. "I've heard enough from you," Isabel said, her voice steady but fierce. "You think you know who I am, but you don't. You only see what's on the surface, and that's not the whole story. I'm not my father's wealth, and I'm not your idea of who I should be. I'm Isabel Hayes, and I've worked my entire life to create something of my own, something that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval." The woman's smirk faltered as Isabel continued. "You might think I don't belong here, but you're wrong. I belong here because I've earned it, not because of my last name, but because of who I am and what I stand for, and I'm not going to let anyone make me feel small again." A wave of silence followed her words. The people around them exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. But Isabel stood firm. This wasn't just a confrontation with the woman in front of her. It was a declaration to the world. She was more than just a name. She was a person with her own identity, her own dreams, and her own purpose. The woman's face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes narrowing as she tried to regain her composure, but it was too late. Isabel had already won. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone else. The crowd had seen it, and the power of her words had resonated deeper than anything the woman could say. As the woman turned on her heel and stormed off, Isabel stood tall. Martin, who had been watching from the sidelines, approached her again, his eyes filled with newfound respect. That was incredible," he said, his voice full of admiration. Isabel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. She had faced her fears, stood up for herself, and in doing so, had taken control of her own story. The crowd, once divided, now seemed to rally around her. Conversations started up again, but this time there was a sense of unity, a recognition that Isabel's words had shaken something within them all. Isabel Hayes had just begun to write her own legacy, one where she wasn't defined by her last name, but by her actions, her strength, and her unshakable belief in her own worth. And as she stood there, watching the crowd slowly disperse, she realized that the night had changed her, just as much as it had changed the world around her. The impact of that night rippled through Isabel's life in ways she hadn't anticipated. The moment of confrontation at the Atlas wasn't just a one-off instance, it was a pivotal turning point, the catalyst for the change she had long been craving. When the woman stormed off, it wasn't just Isabel who felt empowered. The room itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as though a heavy veil of expectation had been lifted. For Isabel, the feeling didn't stop once the evening ended. It stayed with her, carried her through the days that followed. The sense of self-assurance she had gained in that brief confrontation seeped into every part of her life. She began to take control, not just in the world of high society charity events, but in every decision she made. No longer did she feel the need to validate herself by aligning with the world that had once judged her. In the weeks that followed, Isabel made a point of returning to causes that had always sparked her interest, but that she had avoided, perhaps subconsciously, due to fear of being seen as just another privileged person trying to make a difference. She reconnected with grassroots organizations, volunteered at shelters, and attended local community events where the focus was on real-world issues. Through these efforts, Isabel began to forge her own path. One of the most important changes occurred in her relationship with her father. She had always felt the heavy weight of his expectations, constantly being compared to his accomplishments. But as she grew into her own identity, she learned to communicate her desires and boundaries with him. During one quiet dinner, Isabel finally told him what she had discovered about herself, the realization that her worth was not tethered to his success, but to her own values, her own actions. "I want to help, Dad," Isabel had said, looking at him directly, "but I don't want to do it just to fulfill your dreams for me. I want to do it because it matters to me." Her father, who had been a part of the elite circles for most of his life, was quiet for a long time before responding. He finally placed his fork down, his voice surprisingly soft. "I never realized how much you needed to feel that way. I've always been proud of you, Isabel, but I see now I've been proud for the wrong reasons." It was the beginning of a new, more authentic chapter in their relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than expectation. But perhaps the most profound change was the effect Isabel had on the people who had witnessed her stand up to the woman that night. In the following weeks, there were numerous reports of how her words had inspired others. Many of the people who had once dismissed Isabel because of her family background now saw her for who she truly was, an individual capable of change, growth, and empathy. It wasn't about her wealth anymore. It was about her values. The woman at the Atlas, the one who had tried to diminish Isabel, disappeared from the spotlight soon after the event, her words forgotten. Isabel's strength, however, continued to resonate. The way she had stood up for herself had made a lasting impression on everyone who had been there that night. As Isabel reflected on her journey, she realized the profound lesson she had learned. It wasn't the status she had been born into that defined her. It was how she chose to live, what she chose to stand for, and how she treated others along the way. The moral of Isabel's story was clear. We are not the sum of the expectations others have for us, nor are we defined by our family names or wealth. Our true value is in how we make a difference, how we rise in the face of adversity, and how we stand by our beliefs. In the end, it's the courage to be our authentic selves that leaves the most lasting impact. As the camera pulled back, showing Isabel walking out into the world with a new sense of purpose, it was clear that her story was far from over. It was only the beginning, one where she would continue to define her own legacy, not by the privileges of the past, but by the choices she made each day moving forward.